everyone. Welcome back to Black Poets Then and Now. My name is Kara Roseborough, and I'm excited to talk to you today about poet, playwright, abolitionist journalist, and women's rights activist Angelina Weld Grimke. Angelina was born on February 27, 1880 to Archibald Grimke and Sarah Stanley. Angelina's father, Archibald, was born as a slave in South Carolina. He was the son of the plantation slave owner and a slave who worked on the plantation. He lived there until his father died, at which point he was taken in by his paternal aunt, Angelina Grimke Weld, after whom he named his daughter Angelina, and her sister Sarah. The Grimke sisters were prominent Southern white abolitionists who were not only staunchly opposed to the system of slavery, but were strong proponents for gender and racial equality. They helped Archibald move to Boston to attend Harvard University. Archibald was only the second Black person in history to graduate from Harvard Law School. While in Boston, he met Angelina's mother, Sarah. There's very little that's known about Sarah other than that she was from a white middle-class family in the Midwest. She and Archibald married, but they were only married for a short time. Her family was opposed to the marriage because of Archibald's racial background and pressured Sarah to move back home. Unfortunately, she was not able to maintain much of a relationship with her daughter Angelina. Angelina did receive a letter when she was 7 years old from her mother, and it said that the beauty of her mother's prose inspired Angelina to write years later. Angelina, unfortunately, would never get to have much of a relationship with her mother. A few years after leaving Archibald, Sarah committed suicide. When Angelina was 14 years old, she moved to Washington, D.C. to live with her father's brother Francis and his wife Charlotte, while her father went to the Dominican Republic to work as the U.S. consul. When Angelina graduated from high school, she went on to Boston to attend the Boston Normal School of Gymnastics, what's now Wesley College. She graduated from there in 1902 and ended up moving back to Washington, D.C. to live with her father and be near her aunt and uncle. When Angelina moved back to Washington, D.C. in 1902, she got an English teaching job at the Armstrong Mandatory Training School. She worked there for the next 14 years, during which time she was already writing articles, poems, plays about the Black experience and specifically the injustices that Black people faced in the United States. In 1916, she accepted a position at the newly named Dunbar High School, named after poet and playwright Paul Laurence Dunbar, whom we talked about last week. The school was formerly known as the Preparatory High School for Colored Youth, and it was one of the first public high schools intended for Black students. During her tenure there, Angelina was actually the teacher of future poet and playwright May Miller. Angelina spent her summers taking courses and teaching at her father's alma mater, Harvard University. In addition to starting her new job at Dunbar High School, Angelina produced her first play, Rachel, in 1916. Rachel was a 3-act play about a woman who doesn't want to bring a child into a racist world, and it was written specifically in response to and in protest of Birth of a Nation. It had a strong anti-lynching message. At its premiere, it received mixed to negative reviews. It was called overly sentimental and with a defeatist mentality, but its historical significance can't be denied. It was one of the first plays written by a Black author about Black issues, and she ended up publishing the play 4 years later in 1920. Angelina did the bulk of her writing during the 1920s and published during what was known as the Harlem Renaissance, which spread from 1919 to 1929. During this time, there was a boom in art, literature, music, anything, you name it, from the African American community, inspired by the Great Migration from the South to the North. The literature of this time was mostly written by people that had knowledge of life during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, many of whom had parents, grandparents who were slaves. Grimke's work was really ahead of her time. The scenes of violence that she painted were shocking to her audiences and hadn't been seen before in literature prior to the work of Richard Wright. In her short stories, she called for a racial self-genocide that was deemed too emotionally and politically threatening to African Americans and other audiences to receive and accept. In fact, very little of Grimke's work was actually published. That which was anthologized appeared in such publications as Caroling Dusk and Poetry of the Negro. Some of her best known works on Black issues were Beware Lest He Wakes and The Black Finger. Some of her other work, though, like El Beso, was centered more on a yearning for love and tapped into her queer identity that she pretty much had to suppress for most of her life. She actually confronted her father about this when she was just 14 years old. She fell in love with a young woman named Mary Burrell and exchanged letters with her. At one point, she even told Mary that she wanted to marry her. She knew they couldn't be married right now, but talked about it in the future. Her father was not a fan. Not only did he not want Angelina to fall in love and to lose focus, but he probably picked up on the fact that she was a lesbian and didn't approve of her sexual identity. Her father gave her an ultimatum: him or Mary. Angelina chose her father in the end. Grimke remained with her father until he died in 1930. After that, she moved to New York. She may have continued to write, but she stopped publishing, and she lived out the remainder of her life as a semi-recluse. Grimke died in 1958 of illnesses that she struggled with throughout her life after she was in a train crash in 1913. Her work continues to be an important part of not only the Harlem Renaissance canon, but the canon of literature in general for not just the African American community, but America as a whole. And I'm excited to talk to you today about her poem, El Beso.
Twilight and you, quiet, the stars, snare of the shine of your teeth, your provocative laughter, the gloom of your hair, lure of you, eye and lip, yearning, yearning, languor, surrender, your mouth, and madness, madness, tremulous, breathless, flaming, the space of a sigh, then awakening, remembrance, pain, regret, your sobbing, and again quiet, the stars, twilight, and you.
Let's unpack. First of all, this is a lyric poem, and we can pick up on sentiments of desire and longing. Obviously, this is referring to a loved one or someone that she has some kind of romantic desire for. The poem begins with the word twilight. And yes, I'm going word by word here. The poem begins with the word twilight, which I find really interesting because later on when she references other things and relates them to darkness, we start off with this kind of optimistic kind of darkness, twilight. And she talks about stars. There is something very hopeful about that word that contrasts some other things happening later on in the poem. In line 3, she uses the word snare. She says, snare of the shine of your teeth. The shine, the allure of someone, yes, this light that they emit is a trap. And not only that, it's not just an overall shine, it's not just an aura, it's the shine of their teeth, which is so wonderfully specific and so wonderfully specific of a physical trait and kind of strange to pick up on. Obviously, a lot of this poem, she's focusing on the mouth and the lips and the face and things like that. But rather than just saying the glow of the face, she says the shine of the teeth, which I find, again, so wonderfully specific. In line 5, she says, the gloom of your hair. She doesn't just say black hair or dark hair. She says the gloom. Again, gloom is referring to darkness, much like twilight. But unlike twilight, where we can think big night sky with beautiful stars, gloom has more of an ominous connotation to it that lets us know that there's something else going on in this romantic encounter other than just joy. In the following line, she says, lure of you, eye and lip. Again, so there's something kind of hypnotic about this person that she's referring to, relating back to the snare, something that's trapping her, pulling her in. And then again, she refers to physical features. So the lure of you, and then she says eye and lip, rather than like your heart or your soul or something like that. She's again focusing on these features on the face, very externally focused. In the following line, she says, yearning, yearning. She repeats this twice. If you remember our talk last Thursday on Paul Laurence Dunbar, we also talked about his repetition. By saying yearning twice, she's just emphasizing that, really getting across her desire. In the next line, she uses the word languor. I had to look this up. Languor means the state or feeling, often pleasant, of tiredness or inertia, or an oppressive stillness of the air. I think she's mostly referring to the former definition because she says languor, surrender. There's this fatigue, this giving in to whatever is happening. And as we can see, there are some good elements to what's happening in this romantic encounter and some more ominous things that are happening as well. I'm going to skip down to my favorite line in the whole poem, the space of a sigh. It's not enough just to say a sigh, it's the space that it takes up. It gives a sigh, which doesn't really have a physical presence, bringing in that personification element that we talked about last Thursday in Paul Laurence Dunbar's work. Next, I want to talk about what's happening structurally. So if you go back to the first 2 lines and then visit the bottom 4 lines, you'll see that she uses dashes. She has 1 or 2 words, a dash, and then 1 or 2 words. This can be a comparison element. What it also does is it kind of creates these little snapshots of things. Twilight, you, quiet, the stars. It's almost like flashing pictures. And then the chunk that happens in the middle, everything else that we just talked about, feels like it's so present and in the moment. We really get lost with the speaker as they're referring to this kiss, to this romantic encounter. And then she says, then awakening, remembrance. And we're pulled back out of this moment of being really immersed in this moment. And I think she beautifully does that by scaling back the language. She takes back a lot of the gerund, so whether that is flaming or, let's see, yearning, all of those ing words, other descriptive words, and she scales it all back and makes it very simple. I would describe this poem as creating a feeling of intimacy, not only for the language used and Grimke's kind of zeroing in on physical traits specific to the face, eyes, lips, the shine of the teeth, but for her use of second-person narration for this speaker here. So we don't know who's saying these things, although we can just say that it's Grimke for lack of a better person to say. But she refers to everything as you, the gloom of your hair, your teeth, etc., etc. And that draws us into the poem. It makes the audience play a part as this person that she's describing, even if it's not actually us ourselves. She makes us, the audience, in a way, a character in her work. Thank you so much for tuning in today for our talk on Angelina Weld Grimke, a pioneering writer and activist whose work was indicative of the intersectionality between Black and LGBTQIA+ experiences. It's great to keep her legacy alive and revisiting all these greats in the poetic canon of American literature. Tune in Thursday for our talk on Conti Cullen as we continue our look at writers of the Harlem Renaissance. Until then, stay safe and stay creative. Bye!